English version, Part 1 voiceover, 1500 tokens. The company holiday party had always been one of those events that promised laughter, networking, and fleeting glimpses of elegance, a temporary escape from the routine of work and home. This year, I had been invited by my husband, David, to attend with him. I spent the afternoon preparing myself with a meticulous attention to detail, something I had learned over decades of presenting myself with poise. I chose a deep emerald dress, a color my late father always said complemented my silver hair. I styled my hair in gentle waves and added a hint of pearl earrings, the ones I reserved for special occasions, hoping to blend dignity with subtle charm. As we arrived, the entrance hall shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, mirrors reflecting tiny flecks of light onto the polished marble floors. The scent of roast beef and mulled wine mingled with the faint perfume of 100 attendees. I could hear laughter, the subtle clinking of glasses, and the hum of conversations that had nothing to do with me. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine that perhaps tonight would be different, that I might feel some small measure of connection, even acceptance. But that illusion shattered the moment David spoke. Standing close enough that only I could hear, he leaned in and whispered, sharp as a knife, "Sit over there." His hand pointed toward a corner table, far from the center of attention. Then, as if testing the limits of cruelty, he added, "You know, I don't know why you even bother coming. You're nothing but a burden." My hands stiffened, my chest tightened, but I did not react outwardly. The room continued its orchestra of celebration around me, yet I felt the world narrow to the space between us, the distance measured in contempt. I lowered my gaze briefly, tracing the folds of my dress, then took a deep breath. 42 years of marriage had taught me the power of restraint. I offered a small, polite smile, enough to mask the storm inside, and moved deliberately toward the nearest empty table. I reminded myself silently, reactions can be weapons, and I would not let him wield mine. As I settled, I allowed my eyes to wander over the room, noticing the polished suits, the glittering necklaces, the faint smirks on faces I had never met. Servers carried trays with small bites of salmon and tenderloin, their movements precise and almost theatrical. In the corner of my eye, I caught the faint reflection of myself in a gilded mirror, the silver waves of my hair glowing against the deep green of my dress. It was a quiet reminder of who I was, beyond his disdain. Then I saw him. Mr. Thornton, the CEO of David's company, stepped into view. Recognition flared in his eyes as he approached, a flicker of genuine surprise that was not masked by corporate politeness. "Emily," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't expect to see you here." That acknowledgement, though brief, shifted something inside me. It reminded me that presence and reputation could be recognized even when one's own spouse chose to diminish it. I spent the next few moments observing the room, listening to the conversations around me, noting the subtle shifts in posture and glance. David continued his quiet barbs, his words sharp and pointed, meant to provoke a reaction. "You really think you belong here?" He whispered to no one in particular, just loud enough for me to hear. "I suppose some people only know how to live off others." I let the words wash over me, letting them land where they might. My composure remained intact, a silent testament to years of experience, patience, and dignity. Throughout the evening, I found solace in small details. The way the candlelight flickered across the crystal glasses, the careful symmetry of the place settings, the polite nods of acquaintances who had remembered my contributions to charity events and community programs. Slowly, I realized that my presence was noted in ways that David could never touch, that the work and care I had invested over decades had not gone unnoticed. The night stretched before me like a landscape of both threat and opportunity, each hour a chance to demonstrate a quiet, unshakable authority. English version, Part 2 voiceover, 800 tokens. After settling at the corner table, I let the scene unfold before me. David wandered through the room, laughing a little too loudly, making sure his presence dominated every cluster of guests he passed. Each word, each glance, was calculated to draw attention while undermining me, and yet I remained still, a quiet observer cloaked in patience. I had learned long ago that anger was a fire that consumed the one who held it, and tonight, I would not be burned. I sipped my wine, letting the warmth of it settle in my chest, and studied the room. The chandeliers sparkled above, and the crowd swirled like a glittering current, but my focus remained sharp. Across the hall, I noticed subtle movements, an exchange of glances between colleagues that spoke of curiosity, perhaps admiration. The quiet power of experience is often invisible until the right moment, and I felt it settling around me like a gentle aura. Then came the whispers. A server, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres, leaned slightly toward me, as if sensing my presence. "Isn't that Emily Carter?" she murmured to a nearby guest. The words carried through the space, reaching ears that had no reason to know me, and the ripples began. My past contributions to community outreach, the silent hours spent organizing charity events, and the guidance I had offered David's colleagues long ago were suddenly being remembered. Recognition does not always arrive on one's own terms, but it arrives nonetheless. David, oblivious to the shift, continued to make his sharp comments, now with a tinge of irritation as he noticed people quietly looking my way. He attempted a toast, raising his glass, his voice carrying mock admiration. "To those who sit back and do nothing but take credit," he said with a smirk, directed at no one in particular, though the implication was clear. I did not flinch. I listened to the clinking of glasses, the polite murmurs, and the tiny sparks of acknowledgement that I could sense radiating toward me. My calm became a mirror, reflecting the inadequacy of his efforts to humiliate me. As the evening progressed, Mr. Thornton approached once more. He nodded, politely, offering a brief compliment about my organizational work on the company's philanthropic events. "It's good to see you here," he said. That small acknowledgement was enough to bolster my resolve. I realized that influence is not always about loud declarations or dominant presence. It is about consistency, integrity, and quiet competence. The room, though festive, had become a stage for subtle reclamation. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, acknowledging those who approached with friendly words. With every exchange, I felt a shift, not only in perception but in atmosphere. David's smirk faltered ever so slightly, a subtle recognition that the narrative he had attempted to write for the evening was no longer under his control. I would not need dramatic confrontation tonight. The evening itself, and my steadfast composure, were rewriting the story quietly, steadily, and effectively. By the end of this phase of the night, I was no longer just a peripheral figure. My presence carried weight, my experience demanded acknowledgement, and the quiet power I embodied began to speak louder than any words David could offer. The seeds of recognition had been sown, and the subtle justice of the evening had begun to bloom. English version, Part 3 voiceover, 1,000 tokens. By the time the clock had edged past 9, I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. David's confident stride had begun to falter. The carefully cultivated smirk no longer reached his eyes. I observed him from across the room, standing near the bar, trying to maintain his composure while whispers and glances now followed me more than him. It was a delicate shift, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for me, it was the opening I had been waiting for. Mr. Thornton had returned to my side, offering another polite remark about my leadership in prior community initiatives. I nodded graciously, responding with a measured thank you, letting the words linger in the air. Around us, colleagues who had once been merely polite now leaned in, asking questions, recalling memories, acknowledging contributions they had witnessed but never voiced. Each small recognition was a pebble in the tide that was slowly turning. David, sensing that the current had shifted, attempted to regain control. He approached our table with a forced joviality, raising his glass. "I suppose I should toast the real star of the night," he said, aiming to reclaim authority. But the moment he opened his mouth, a few of the colleagues we had quietly engaged with earlier stepped forward, interrupting the attempt with affirmations of my achievements. The room began to hum with the quiet power of truth and integrity, a chorus David could neither control nor silence. I remained seated, calm and composed, letting the recognition unfold naturally. I allowed myself a faint, controlled smile, realizing that every insult, every attempt to humiliate me, had been absorbed and deflected by decades of resilience. David's face grew pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. I could feel the weight of his frustration even from a distance. A small group of employees I had mentored years ago now approached, offering congratulations and sharing how my guidance had shaped their careers. I thanked them warmly, acknowledging each with eye contact and subtle gestures. Every nod, every polite comment was a tiny victory, a testament to influence earned through actions, rather than intimidation. The crescendo came when Mr. Thornton raised a toast, this time publicly, emphasizing my contributions. Tonight, we honor someone whose quiet work behind the scenes has touched more lives than most could ever imagine. Emily Carter, your dedication and vision continue to inspire all of us. Glasses lifted. Conversations paused. I could see the color drain from David's face as the room collectively recognized the power and respect I had earned, independent of his presence or approval. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to that acknowledgement. I realized that my patience, my silent endurance, and my unwavering composure had rewritten the narrative of the evening. Humiliation had been replaced by quiet authority, and the power balance that David had assumed to control was now irreversibly reversed. By the end of the toast, I felt an inner calm, a quiet triumph. No words of vengeance were necessary. No dramatic confrontation was required. The night had delivered justice in the most elegant and enduring way possible. As David stepped back, his attempts at dominance rendered meaningless. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the warmth remind me of my own strength and dignity. English version, Part 4 voiceover, 1,000 tokens. The night had reached its turning point. David's posture, once confident and commanding, now seemed strained, his carefully measured gestures betraying a growing awareness that the balance had shifted. I noticed the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth, the slight hesitation in the way he raised his glass. Every smile he tried to force faltered under the weight of the recognition that the room had begun to see me for who I truly was. Not the shadow figure he had tried to cast me as, but someone respected, influential, and quietly formidable. I allowed myself a measured smile, one that carried the calm assurance of someone who had endured years of subtle undermining. I stood slowly, adjusting the folds of my dress, feeling the fabric settle against my frame as if it were armor rather than decoration. The room seemed to take notice. A few heads turned, some eyebrows raised, and in that subtle shift, I felt the room acknowledging my presence as more than a guest. I was an equal, perhaps even the quiet center around which attention now gravitated. Mr. Thornton approached again, this time gesturing for me to join him near the head table. I accepted, walking with deliberate composure, every step reinforcing the dignity I carried silently for decades. Guests whispered as I passed, their murmurs a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. David followed, attempting to appear casual, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the internal reckoning he could no longer mask. At the head table, I was greeted warmly by several senior colleagues and members of the board. Compliments flowed naturally, referencing initiatives I had spearheaded, decisions I had influenced, and a legacy of leadership that had quietly shaped the company's culture for years. Each acknowledgement, each polite nod, acted like a brick reinforcing the foundation of authority I had long held in the shadows. David's eyes darted around, realizing, too late, that he could not reclaim the narrative. I engaged in conversation with a few key colleagues, asking about upcoming projects, listening carefully, and offering insights that reflected my experience. I spoke with measured tone, allowing each word to resonate without arrogance. Slowly, I could see the pattern: whispers of admiration, subtle glances of acknowledgement, a recognition that my contributions had been underestimated for far too long. The whispers began to coalesce into visible respect. David's previous smirks now gave way to tight lips and a pale complexion. Then came the moment of undeniable triumph. Mr. Thornton, in a gesture both deliberate and public, raised his glass to me once more. Tonight, we honor not just the work of one individual, but the perseverance, insight, and quiet leadership that have inspired us all. Emily Carter, your legacy within this company is undeniable. Glasses lifted around the room. The room seemed to shift subtly, like a tide acknowledging its true center. I felt a quiet heat rise in my chest, not anger, but satisfaction. David remained at the edge of the gathering, his attempts to command attention nullified by the visible respect and admiration I now received effortlessly. I did not need to speak to assert myself. The acknowledgement of my peers, the recognition of my achievements, had already done it. Every conversation I joined, every exchange of glance or smile, reinforced that the evening had been rewritten. I had transformed humiliation into triumph, invisibility into acknowledgement, all without a word of confrontation. As the night progressed, the energy of the room became unmistakably centered around me. I could see people referencing my past projects, asking my opinion, including me in discussions I had once been deliberately excluded from. David's earlier attempts at undermining me were now irrelevant. My authority, built over decades, had asserted itself in the most elegant way possible. I realized, in that moment, that power often lies not in volume or aggression, but in patience, composure, and the quiet accumulation of influence. I paused briefly to take a breath, looking around the room with calm satisfaction. The whispers, the nods, the slight gestures of respect, they were all mine, earned by experience, perseverance, and dignity. David's face, shadowed by realization and a subtle regret, was a stark contrast to the warmth, acknowledgement, and deference that surrounded me. I took another slow sip of wine, savoring not the drink, but the knowledge that the tide had turned. The night, once fraught with humiliation, had become a testament to quiet strength, earned respect, and undeniable authority. English version, Part 5 voiceover, 800 tokens. By the midpoint of the evening, the shift in energy was undeniable. Conversations that had once skirted around me now drew me in. I realized that my influence, long understated, was now visible and respected. David's presence, once imposing, had been reduced to an awkward peripheral. I observed him from across the room, the confident ease replaced by a growing discomfort. His attempts at jokes fell flat, smiles forced, and his eyes darted nervously toward those now engaged with me. I allowed myself to bask quietly in the subtle victories. I spoke with colleagues I had mentored, offering insights, sharing advice, and guiding conversations with a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. Every nod, every attentive glance, reinforced the undeniable truth. The room now recognized my competence, my dignity, and my rightful place at the center. Mr. Thornton, noticing the growing attention I commanded, moved closer, introducing me to additional executives and managers. Each introduction carried a sense of validation, a public acknowledgement that I was more than a guest or a spouse accompanying someone else. I was a respected presence in my own right. David's lips pressed into a thin line as he realized that no amount of posturing could alter the perception forming around me. When a group of employees approached, seeking my opinion on upcoming projects, I listened attentively, responded with measured advice, and allowed the weight of my years of experience to speak louder than any words David could ever muster. The murmurs of admiration swelled, and the subtle currents of influence began to fully flow in my direction. For the first time, David's attempts to dominate the evening were nullified entirely. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing one's strength is measured not in loud declarations, but in consistent, patient action. The room now recognized the authority I had earned over decades of work, kindness, and competence. I had become, in essence, the unspoken center of the evening's attention. David, once the orchestrator of power, now hovered on the outskirts, helplessly observing as respect. An acknowledgement radiated outward from me. As the evening continued, I made deliberate eye contact with various colleagues, a subtle assertion of control and recognition. Conversations that had previously excluded me now sought my input. Laughter and smiles directed my way rather than his. David's discomfort was palpable. He realized fully that the power he assumed he held had shifted irrevocably. Every glance, every gesture, every word of mine reinforced the balance of authority that now tilted entirely in my favor. In that moment, I knew that the night was mine, not through confrontation or drama, but through calm, patient assertion of who I was and what I had earned. The stage was set, the narrative rewritten, and the path to the evening's climax fully prepared. English version, Part 6 voiceover, 800 tokens. The moment had arrived. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted noticeably, a collective attention aligning in my direction. Every conversation, every glance, seemed to pause as if the room itself had acknowledged the quiet authority I carried. I stood, adjusting the folds of my dress with measured grace, and stepped toward the center of the gathering. Each footfall felt deliberate, an assertion of presence that had been earned through years of patience, experience, and quiet strength. David's eyes widened slightly as he realized the full scope of what was happening. His earlier attempts at control and intimidation now seemed trivial in the face of the recognition I commanded effortlessly. The whispers around the room grew into soft affirmations, colleagues nodding, some murmuring compliments of past initiatives I had led. Even the younger employees, who had barely known me before, turned to listen when I spoke. The shift was palpable. The narrative of the evening was no longer his to write. It had been rewritten by my presence alone. Mr. Thornton gestured for me to address the group, and I spoke with calm authority, recounting a few lessons from past projects, subtly reminding the room of the work that had gone unnoticed for too long. My voice carried over the soft hum of the party, confident yet understated, allowing my achievements to speak for themselves. As I spoke, I could feel the room responding, smiles, nods, and thoughtful glances acknowledging both the influence and the integrity I had cultivated quietly over decades. David tried to interject, to reclaim attention, but the room no longer followed his lead. His face betrayed frustration, a mixture of disbelief and resignation as he realized that power was not claimed through dominance alone. I allowed my words to fill the space, not loud, not aggressive, but firm and measured, each one reinforcing the authority that had always belonged to me. By the end of my remarks, the room had shifted completely. Colleagues approached with congratulations, seeking advice, or simply acknowledging my presence with respect. David remained at the periphery, isolated not by words, but by the silent consensus of recognition that had formed around me. I did not need to confront him directly. The room had done it for me. My patience, composure, and experience had rewritten the evening's hierarchy. As I returned to my seat, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of triumph that was both serene and profound. The power I had always quietly commanded was now acknowledged openly. The humiliation of earlier had been transformed into validation, respect, and undeniable authority. The evening, once dominated by anxiety and uncertainty, had become a testament to enduring strength, earned influence, and the quiet victory of a life well lived. English version, Part 7 voiceover, 800 tokens. By this point in the evening, it was clear, David's influence had evaporated. The confident demeanor he had worn like armor all night had crumbled, replaced by unease and frustration that even he could not hide. He lingered at the edge of conversations, attempting to interject with a joke or a boast, but the room no longer responded to him. The authority he had presumed to wield had quietly shifted to me, and the shift was palpable. Every glance, every nod, every smile now reinforced the new balance of respect. I moved through the room deliberately, exchanging pleasantries, acknowledging old acquaintances, and offering insight where appropriate. Each interaction radiated competence, patience, and quiet strength. Colleagues leaned in to listen, asking questions that invited my perspective, and in those moments, I felt the culmination of years of effort, experience, and dignity being recognized. David's face grew increasingly pale, the corners of his mouth tight, as he realized his attempts at dominance had been completely neutralized. The subtle murmurs of admiration around the room grew louder, carrying the weight of recognition. Even those who had never worked closely with me now nodded politely or smiled with a newfound respect. It was a silent, collective acknowledgement that I had earned my place, not by force, not by loud assertions, but through a life of measured action, perseverance, and quiet excellence. David's frustration was compounded by the fact that he could do nothing to reclaim it. The room had collectively rewritten the hierarchy, and I was at its center. I paused for a moment to reflect, a small, controlled smile crossing my lips. My composure had turned the tide. The whispers, glances, and subtle affirmations were my allies. I did not need to raise my voice or confront him directly. The evening itself had become a testament to the power I had carried silently all along. Each nod, each question, each polite acknowledgement strengthened my position, and David's failure to assert control was evident to all. As I walked past tables, colleagues excusing themselves to speak to me or ask advice. The contrast between us became unmistakable. Where I moved with dignity and calm authority, David hovered in the periphery, isolated and powerless. The invisible threads of influence, cultivated over decades, now directed the flow of attention and respect entirely toward me. I could feel the room shifting, energy and acknowledgement following my every move, a quiet but unmistakable confirmation that the evening's balance had irrevocably changed. The realization settled in. My patience, perseverance, and composed strength had not only preserved my dignity, but had elevated it to a visible, undeniable presence. David, once the orchestrator of the evening, now witnessed firsthand the extent of his failure. I had turned what could have been humiliation into empowerment, and every interaction reinforced my authority. And so, as the evening continued, I began to prepare for the final moments, the climax of the night, where the respect, acknowledgement, and subtle triumphs of the evening would coalesce, leaving no doubt of my influence, dignity, and the quiet but total reversal of power. English version, Part 8 voiceover, 800 tokens. The room had become an arena of subtle revelation, and the moment of complete triumph had arrived. I stood near the center of the ballroom, the warm glow of chandeliers reflecting off the polished floors, and felt the shift settle fully around me. David, once the orchestrator of attention, lingered near the edge, pale and stiff, each gesture betraying the acknowledgement he could no longer suppress. Every glance from colleagues, every polite nod, reinforced a truth he could not alter. I had emerged not only unscathed but elevated, commanding a respect he had tried to monopolize. Mr. Thornton raised his glass again, this time gesturing to me directly. Tonight, we recognize a lifetime of commitment, insight, and influence that has quietly shaped this company. Emily Carter, your work, your patience, and your integrity are an example to us all. The room erupted in polite applause, gentle yet undeniable. It was a moment where every whisper, every small acknowledgement, converged into a clear, public recognition of my authority. I allowed a small, composed smile to cross my face, acknowledging the room with calm dignity. I did not need to speak further to assert my position. The way the attendees gravitated toward me, the way David's forced demeanor contrasted with the warmth and respect directed at me, told the story far more effectively than any words could. For decades, I had carried the quiet strength, and now, in one evening, it became evident to all. David tried one last feeble attempt, leaning in with a comment meant to belittle, but it fell flat, met instead with polite nods and soft laughter that excluded him entirely. The room had chosen its narrative, and it no longer included him as a center of authority. I felt a deep, serene satisfaction, not vindictive, but complete in its affirmation. My reputation, my dignity, and my presence were affirmed in a way that no insult could undo. As I moved toward the exit, colleagues lingered to shake my hand, offer congratulations, and express admiration. The attention, respect, and acknowledgement followed me with each step, an invisible but unmistakable current, reinforcing the victory I had claimed quietly over the years. David remained in the background, isolated, his previous power reduced to an impotent shadow of its former self. I took one last look across the room, a measured glance that conveyed authority without arrogance. The evening, which had begun with humiliation and whispered doubts, had ended with undeniable triumph. The patience, perseverance, and composure that had carried me through years of subtle undermining were now fully recognized, celebrated, and impossible to dispute. I had transformed a night of potential shame into a testament to enduring strength, quiet influence, and the ultimate vindication of a life lived with integrity. And as the final applause faded and the ballroom lights dimmed, I walked out with poise, my head held high, fully aware that my victory was complete, not through confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of respect and acknowledgement that had always been mine to claim. English version, Part 9 voiceover, 800 tokens. The party had shifted entirely. The whispers and polite nods I had noticed earlier had grown into clear, visible respect. I could feel it radiating toward me as I moved through the room, each interaction reinforcing the authority I had quietly cultivated for decades. David, now fully aware of his defeat, lingered near the bar, isolated and tense. He attempted to join conversations, but the attention no longer followed him. He was a shadow in a room that had recognized my presence and influence. I paused for a moment to observe him, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders, the forced nature of his gestures, the way he attempted to insert himself into discussions but was consistently ignored. It was a stark reminder of the difference between superficial dominance and earned respect. True authority cannot be claimed through intimidation. It is recognized and acknowledged by others, and that recognition now surrounded me completely. A few younger colleagues approached me, their questions careful but genuine, seeking insight on ongoing projects and asking for guidance. I answered with calm assurance, each word measured, each suggestion deliberate. I realized that the influence I wielded did not require loud proclamations or displays of power. It emerged naturally through competence, composure, and the cumulative weight of past actions. Even David's former allies began to shift, recognizing the undeniable truth in the room. The polite nods he might have commanded earlier now directed themselves toward me. Small gestures of deference, subtle acknowledgments, and quiet affirmations of my contributions filled the space. I moved deliberately through the crowd, accepting congratulations and guidance inquiries with grace. Each interaction solidified my position and demonstrated that power, once earned, cannot easily be taken away. As the night progressed, I could see that my patience and restraint had created a ripple effect. Conversations that once excluded me now sought my opinion. Laughter and attention that had belonged to David gradually moved toward me. The balance of influence had been completely overturned. I did not need to assert it through confrontation. The room itself confirmed my victory. I glanced across the ballroom and saw David, isolated, aware that his previous tactics had failed completely. The tension in his posture, the tightness around his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. My presence alone had rewritten the social hierarchy of the evening, and his attempts to dominate were utterly powerless against the acknowledgement I now received effortlessly. At that moment, I understood a truth that had guided me for decades. Authority is earned through consistency, integrity, and patience, not through aggression or control. The humiliation I had endured earlier in the night had been transformed into validation, respect, and the quiet triumph of a life lived deliberately. And as I moved to rejoin Mr. Thornton and several colleagues for the next segment of the evening, I felt the evening's rhythm fully aligned with the narrative I had claimed, the narrative of earned influence, dignity, and undeniable authority. English version, Part 10 voiceover, 700 tokens. The evening had reached its final chapters, and the atmosphere was unmistakably in my favor. Every conversation, every glance, every polite acknowledgement confirmed what had been building all night. I was no longer in the shadow of humiliation. David, once the center of attention, lingered awkwardly near the bar, fully aware of his defeat. His attempts at humor and charm now fell flat, drowned out by the quiet respect that radiated from colleagues and executives alike. I moved deliberately through the room, greeting colleagues, responding to questions, and offering advice with calm assurance. Each step, each interaction, reinforced the authority I had earned over decades. There was no need for confrontation. The room itself validated my presence and influence. I felt the weight of recognition settle over me, not loudly or aggressively, but subtly, undeniably. David's frustration was evident, his shoulders stiff, his eyes avoiding direct contact with anyone whose attention now followed me. He had realized fully that his previous dominance had been replaced by quiet, earned authority that could not be challenged by words or gestures alone. I allowed a serene smile to cross my face, acknowledging the room, allowing the weight of my years, patience, and resilience to do what confrontation never could. As the evening drew to a close, colleagues came forward to shake my hand, offer congratulations, and express genuine admiration. The attention and respect followed me with every movement, a visible testament to the quiet but undeniable victory I had claimed. David, meanwhile, remained isolated, unable to reclaim the influence he had once wielded effortlessly. The contrast between us could not have been clearer, my composed authority, his impotent frustration. In that moment, I realized the true lesson of the evening. Strength is measured not in loud declarations or public displays of power, but in the patient, steady accumulation of influence, dignity, and respect. Humiliation, no matter how public or cruel, can be transformed into triumph through perseverance and composure. And as I prepared to leave the ballroom, the applause and respectful nods of colleagues behind me served as the final confirmation. The evening had been entirely rewritten by the quiet power I had carried all along. English version, Part 11 voiceover, 700 tokens. The room had quieted slightly as the evening approached its final moments, but the energy around me remained unmistakable. Every glance, every polite nod, every soft acknowledgement reinforced what had become undeniable. My presence commanded respect. I moved gracefully among the remaining guests, shaking hands, answering questions, and engaging in quiet conversation. Each interaction carried weight, reflecting the authority I had built over decades of patient effort and subtle influence. David lingered near the bar, his posture stiff, hands gripping the counter, clearly aware that the narrative of the evening had passed him by. He opened his mouth to comment, to draw attention, but no one leaned in to listen. The shift was complete. The room had embraced the recognition of my competence, dignity, and quiet power. Every small gesture, an attentive glance, a courteous nod, a whispered acknowledgement, added to the weight of my victory. I took a moment to observe the contrast. Where I walked with composure, confidence, and quiet authority, David's presence seemed almost invisible. His previous attempts to dominate, to control, to humiliate, had been completely nullified. I had turned every insult, every dismissive remark, every attempt at belittlement into an opportunity to demonstrate my calm strength. The evening was no longer his stage. It was mine, subtly but undeniably. Mr. Thornton came forward, engaging in conversation that included both praise and reflection on past initiatives. I responded with measured insights, letting my words and demeanor speak louder than any self-proclaimed authority could. Colleagues who had once overlooked me now sought guidance, asked questions, and included me in discussions I had previously been excluded from. The influence I had quietly cultivated was now fully visible, a tangible force that even David could not contest. As the final moments approached, I felt the culmination of years of resilience, patience, and quiet determination settle over me. The applause, the respectful acknowledgments, and the lingering attention confirmed that the evening had been rewritten. David had no remaining tools to assert dominance. His earlier confidence had dissolved, replaced by the subtle recognition of the power he could no longer touch. In that room, amidst soft laughter and polite conversation, I realized the full extent of my triumph. The evening had transformed from one of potential humiliation to one of undeniable authority and recognition. My calm composure, patience, and earned influence had rewritten the social hierarchy, leaving David isolated and powerless. And as I prepared to take the final steps toward the exit, I carried with me the certainty that my dignity, patience, and quiet strength had been acknowledged by all, a victory that required no confrontation, only the quiet assertion of who I had always been. English version, Part 12 voiceover, 800 tokens. The evening had reached its ultimate moment. The room, once filled with subtle tension and whispered judgments, now acknowledged my presence fully. Every glance, every polite nod, every respectful murmur was a testament to the authority and influence I had cultivated over decades. David, pale and rigid, remained at the edge of the room, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. He had no words left, no gestures that could regain the respect I now commanded effortlessly. I walked slowly toward the exit, each step deliberate, radiating calm authority. Colleagues stopped to shake my hand, offer congratulations, or simply acknowledge me with a smile. The shift in attention was unmistakable. What had once been David's domain was now mine, claimed through patience, resilience, and quiet strength. The applause and soft murmurs of acknowledgement followed me like a current, affirming the victory I had earned without confrontation or dramatics. As I paused at the doorway, I took a moment to look back across the room. David stood there, a shadow of his former confidence, powerless and defeated. The subtle expressions on the faces of my colleagues, the nods, the smiles, The lingering eye contact spoke volumes. The evening had been rewritten. Humiliation had transformed into recognition. Ridicule had transformed into respect. I realized that true power is never shouted or demanded. It is earned through consistency, integrity, and patience. The respect I commanded tonight had been built quietly over years of thoughtful action, guidance, and resilience. The humiliation I had endured earlier had been transformed into a profound affirmation of who I was, and the influence I carried silently had finally been seen and acknowledged by all. Stepping out of the ballroom, I felt a sense of serene triumph. The night had started with tension, insult, and uncertainty, yet it ended with undeniable recognition of my dignity and authority. David's defeat was complete, not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of presence and competence. As I walked into the cool night air, I understood the enduring lesson: true power and respect are not seized in anger or argument. They are cultivated in silence, demonstrated through actions, and acknowledged by those who recognize real integrity. And so, the evening concluded. The whispers of admiration, the nods of respect, and the quiet acknowledgement of my presence lingered, leaving David isolated and powerless, while I walked away, head held high, embodying the quiet, undeniable triumph of a life lived with dignity and patience.